in our case, or in any biological creature, what they eat. Okay, and in a minute here we'll get to the importance of that. But in any event, a common kind of neuron that our outer bodies use, in our case, is the acetylcholine. Okay, now remember what I said about these chemically activated gates, is that these things here are like keys. The metaphor, the usual metaphor, is that these things are like keys that fit into a keyhole here in this chemically activated gate, causing it to open.
Is that like a receptor? Is that like a receptor?
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a second. Anyway, they fit into a keyhole here, and here, and here, causing these particular neurochemical, or these chemically activated gates to open and close again, kind of like a camera shutter. And if the accumulated voltage, associated with this synapse, the synaptic button, is sufficient, it will fire, because of field effects, it will fire these voltage activated gates. And then that starts this process of having a signal move down from the dendrites to the axon, and then causing, neuron 2 now to fire, maybe. What's interesting about these gates here, these chemically activated gates, and the concept of a key and a keyhole, is that, and let's say that, okay, we're looking at our acetylcholine receptors. Let's say we cut our finger and it gets a little infected, or better yet, we burn our finger. Okay, and now the damn thing hurts. And so you're sitting there taking notes and your damn finger hurts because you burned it, and it keeps hurting. Okay, what do you normally do for something like that, minor injury like that? Well, one normally takes something like aspirin or Tylenol, something like that. Okay, aspirin is acetylsalicylic acid. Acetylsalicylic, acetylcholine. Okay, the acetyl is in there. Okay, and then Tylenol is acetaminophen. Okay, again, the acetyl part is in there. In other words, those are similar molecules contained in aspirin and contained in Tylenol as the neurochemical transmitters that's causing your finger to hurt. Okay, so that when you take an aspirin or a Tylenol or any of those kinds of products, what happens is that those molecules are digested. They pass through the blood-brain barrier. Remember, this is not blood, this is brain stuff. They pass through the blood-brain barrier. Now they are in here. Okay, then now you got these Tylenol molecules running around in here. And as it turns out, those particular molecules, the acetylsalicylic acid of aspirin, for example, fits into the keyhole, but it won't open the gate. Okay, it just won't, the gate doesn't open, but it fits into the keyhole. So what you have when you take Tylenol or aspirin or ibuprofen or any number of other things like that, is they'll fit these keyholes, thus there's something in them, and so the real ones that actually open and close the gates don't fit. They can't get in there because there's a damn acetaminophen molecule in there, so they don't fire. As a result of that, regardless of how rich this area here is in these actual neurochemicals, if you've also got it loaded up with things like Tylenol or something like that, then what will happen is these will open and close less often. And as a result of that, this will fire less often than this is firing. Okay, now, one of the things that is prevalent in neurobiology is a thing called frequency coding. Okay, in other words, information is transmitted in a frequency coding sort of a way. And as a matter of fact, that used to be really the big deal way that information was traveled. And it traveled, and it was just simply by frequency. So that if this is neuron 1 here, okay, and this is neuron 2 here, okay, then N1, if it's firing very rapidly, that will mean something like, oh my God, my finger really hurts from that burn, or if it's your eye, if it's the nerve ganglia that transmits information from your eyeball to the back of your brain here where your visual cortex is, that would be like somebody flashing a bulb in your face, a flash bulb in your face. You know, and what happens is a real high frequency nerve spike generation, extremely high. And it can get fairly high, you know, that nerve spike generation. Okay, again, now in the case of a burned finger, that's acetylcholine neurons, and Tylenol and aspirin will generally mitigate that firing, so that if neuron is firing, neuron 1 is your sensory neuron here in your finger, then neuron 2 is in the small of your back, let's say, where it all connects to your brain and makes you feel pain. Well, that will fire less. Neuron 2 will be firing less frequently. Okay, now, that had been suspected for a long time, and then there's also one thing that was known. Okay, now we're moving into like 1975, let's say in that area. Okay, now we're getting fairly recent now. Okay, they had known things like, obviously, morphine, for example, and various other things like that, but particularly morphine. They've known a long time. Well, shoot, that stuff works pretty good at deadening pain. You know, and they've known that for a long time. And we didn't have the opium wars for nothing, or China, or wherever we had them. You know, and so these things were known to work. But there was always a question of, well, how is it that they work? How do they work? How does that work? How do they work? How does a morphine, some plant that you have, that you extract this stuff from, how does it work that you can ingest that and it hasn't such a dramatic effect on us? Well, as a result of that kind of information, what we now know as chemically activated gates became known as opiate receptor sites. And those are the opiate receptors. Okay, now there was a big move on then to find, prove or establish, that this gap then was characterized, at least on this postsynaptic side, which this side is. Remember, information is going this way. This is the presynaptic side, postsynaptic side. Okay, the postsynaptic side it was surmised that they must have opiate receptor sites, so the problem was to demonstrate that in fact those things even existed. Okay, somewhere around 1978, somewhere in there, a graduate student by the name of Candace Pert came up with an experiment that she then performed, which established then the existence of opiate receptor sites. Okay, so now there's a whole story that goes along with that, Nobel Prizes and everything else for her main professor and so on and so forth. But anyway, she's the one that did it. She's fairly well known, and if you want to read an interesting book that she wrote, it's on them. You can get anything from Amazon.com, but order it. It's called The Molecules of Emotion, and it's a very good book. And how is it that it affects emotion? Well, Candace Pert was the one that discovered that. Okay, these receptor sites, these opiate receptor sites are actually real. They're actually there. Okay, and then later on, these things became more generically known as chemically activated gates. Because then we could start doing, as soon as, now Dr. Berg, discovered that, well, then we could start talking about, wait a minute here. How does aspirin work? How does this work? How does that work? The other questions that came out of that was, how come these people who are taking these really crummy drugs that somebody made in their kitchen sink, and they got their high out of them, but now they're frozen into supposition. How does that work? Okay, but the answers now could keep on coming, and as it turns out, the drug addictions, turned out to be the linchpin that discovered a lot of things. Like, for example, that frozen into position, the so-called frozen addicts. That was the initial, that was the clue, the primary clue that led to an understanding of Parkinson's disease, for example. Okay, Parkinson's disease, utilizes, or that is a consequence of an entirely different neuron and assembly of neurons, but nevertheless, that they were taking this particular drug led to how it was Parkinson's disease occurred. And we'll get into that a little bit later too, as soon as we get into the structure of the brain. Okay, these opiate receptor sites, anyway, predominate on the synaptic button, and we know now that we can have all kinds of, because of the discoveries that have been made nowadays, what we have are all kinds of drugs, that go after those opiate receptor sites in a particular way. Okay, so that what we have today are, for example, drugs that affect every system in the body. For example, that cartoon, Prozac. That Prozac, what that is Prozac is Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, it's called. And you'll recall that I had said that you have a lot of different chemicals, neurochemicals, that are used by the body. And I had suggested 50, perhaps even 100. There's certainly 50. Nowadays, probably 100 or more. Okay, and then those come in different flavors and colors, following along the quantum mechanical language. Okay, that those particular those particular molecules come in different flavors and colors, so that in the sense of Prozac, the reason they call it selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, now remember it's serotonin now, it's not acetylcholine, it's the serotonin neurochemical, and it's selective, and it's a reuptake inhibitor. Now, as it turns out, nature has provided some other ways to affect the firing of this synapse. Okay, we've seen some ways, like morphine, for example, fits all the keyholes and it stays in there for a long time. So that when a person has some ugly form of cancer, for example, and you visit them in the hospital, they'll be on morphine drip, because that goes into all of those pain receptor molecules, plugs up the keyholes, and they stay there for a long time. Aspirin and Tylenol stay there for a little while, but they only plug up, not very many of those keyholes, but they plug up some of them. Now we have the ability to go in there and make designer drugs, plugging up which ones we want. Now, as it turns out, nature has done more than just this side. Now, we can affect the firing between neuron 1 and neuron 2 by opiates and Tylenol and all that stuff, but then we also have this side to work with. As it turns out, there are gates on this side too. Okay, and those gates are called reuptake gates. Okay, so what happens to these gates is these neurochemicals go back up here. They're taken back up. Okay, so they're going that way, anti-parallel to the field. Okay, that's telling you some electromagnetic things there about the neurons. Okay, neurons are getting to be real electromagnetic devices here. You know, they really are. I mean, those things are like cylindrical capacitors. They're like coaxial cable. They're like all of those things. They have, in other words, neurons have cable properties. And the cable properties that you use for cables are used for neurons too. And if you go to any modern neurobiology textbook, you need to have a little bit of physics or you aren't getting through it anytime soon, because you know they do explain things in terms of electronics in most graduate neurobiology textbooks. Okay, now these reuptake inhibitors are also protein molecules. I mean, not inhibitors. Reuptake gates are also protein molecules. They open and close by virtue of the abundance of these neurochemicals too, and they take up those same molecules. They take them up back into the cell. Okay, if you do that, let's say, now in the case of Prozac, in the serotonin system, okay, this is serotonin vesicles coming down here, and it's filling this up to some natural level. Okay, whatever natural is, whatever level that is. Okay, and it causes this neuron, if it's firing at a certain rate, it causes this neuron to fire at a certain rate. We already know if we stick this person full of chemicals like opiates and whatnot, their mood is going to change. Okay, so that by virtue of the fact that this kind of thing, these kinds of things, these receptors are going to have those artificial chemicals in them, morphine, and close them off. So that whether this one is firing or not, this one is going to be firing at a less intense pattern. Okay, that's the frequency coding. The frequency coding is changed from more to less. Okay, the same can be said of the reuptake inhibitors. On this presynaptic side, if they are taking up neurochemicals as fast as they're being dumped out, then the richness of this area, the gap, the synaptic cleft, will also become less, and so neuron 2 will also fire less. Okay, so if neuron 1 is firing at a rate, whatever that rate is, neuron 2 will fire at a slower rate. Okay, now with serotonin gates, or means those gates of neurochemicals, the last I looked in the neurobiological literature, there were 11 different serotonin reuptake gates. Okay, and the reason Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake gate, because it will affect about 4 of those 11 gates. Okay, so different parts of the brain, the serotonin system of the brain then are affected by by Prozac. Okay, now, but you know, and Prozac works real well for some people and not so well for others. Prozac is generally considered a drug for depression. Okay, and it changes your mood, okay, so that you're not depressed. Okay, but let's say it doesn't work on you. Well, that's all right. They've got a gazillion more of them, you know, that are different. And those operate, you know, like Wellbutrin, for instance, and there's just an endless supply of these things that are so-called designer drugs, which affect different parts of the same serotonin system by virtue of the fact that it affects different, you know, the different flavors of serotonin, let's say. Okay, that's why they had all of these different kinds of drugs. And does it work? Yeah. You know, there's no more psychology anymore. It's all what, back when I used to teach here in neuropsychology, it was called orthomolecular psychiatry. You know, now it's all orthomolecular psychiatry. You go into anybody and you, oh gosh, I'm feeling bad. Well, exactly how are you feeling bad? Well, I'm afraid of people. Oh yeah, here's a pill. You know, and they give you this pill for it. And the hell of it is that in most cases, it works. That's the reason I put that you know, cartoon in there. Now, how do I know it works? Well, because I take Prozac. And I take it all the time. It's a rest of my life sort of a drug. And why is that? Well, the reason for it is that in my normal state, I have a firing rate in this particular system that is incorrect for a good mood. So I went to my doctor over here in Alaska, Native Medical Center here, and we talked about it. And, you know, and I know about this stuff, and she knew about it. So we just came up with this plan, and then finally we hit on it. You know, and I know there's other things to take, and she knows there's other things to take. But I decided, well, what the hell, let's start with Prozac, you know, and do that. So we did that, and you know, came to the appropriate dosage and so on and so forth. And so something very similar to that cartoon happened to me personally. And I know that happened because I worked with my doctor to cause it to happen through this method. And does it have any side effects? No, not that yeah, it has a side effect. Makes me better, makes me happier, not as depressed. That's a good side effect. But it's a designer drug. All it's supposed to do is affect a certain number of reuptake inhibitors, thus causing neuron 1 or neuron 2 to fire less often than neuron 1. And that's what it does. And presumably, that's about the only side effect. There's another, now, you know, speaking of, you know, I had mentioned a little while ago that this is brain fluid and it's composed of all kinds of neurochemicals, and the brain fluid is typically characterized as an ionic fluid. You know, sodium and potassium and calcium, etc., which have ionic forms. And, you know, obviously sodium does, you know, because that's like salt water. Okay, and so that's what that is. And I had mentioned that it depends on what you eat. You know, that's what is contained in your brain fluid. Okay, if you take a lot of drugs, obviously that's going to affect everything because it shuts down your postsynaptic site of a lot of different neurons, a lot of them. You know, it's a very broad spectrum drug. On the other hand, Prozac or other drugs like that will only tend to affect the presynaptic side and only in a very limited sense. And it will also have an effect on that brain fluid. What Candace Pert did in her book, The Molecules of Emotion, was point out to people that they can eat, you know, behave, you know, like don't drink so damn much or whatever, you know, or coffee, don't have so much coffee or whatever it is, whatever the story is, and showed them how it makes an argument for how that affects your emotions. Now, for example, coffee has the same effect as cocaine. cocaine, because coffee and cocaine are similar cousins. Cocaine affects the reuptake gates. What does cocaine do by all accounts? If you read the case studies, every cocaine addict says that's the best feeling they ever had. They never felt better in their lives, except when they're taking cocaine. Okay, now when they start getting addicted to it, well, what's the drive to take more of it? God, it's not good for you, because you always have a crash. You'd think the crash would be good enough to get them away from cocaine, but they're still, that's the happiest moment they ever had in their lives. You may talk to some cocaine addicts, and they, by God, it really is. You can see it in their face when they talk about that.
I may have misheard you on something. If I understand you correctly, there's in an unmedicated environment, there's a quantity of chemical messengers in the middle there. If you take an acetylcholine inhibitor like aspirin or acetaminophen, you reduce the firing. Am I correct that if you take a selective serotonin inhibitor where you're reducing the uptake, you increase the firing rather than decrease?
You still decrease it. Yeah,
and I'm confused how that works.
Because the neurochemicals in here now are less.
No, but then I'm backwards. Those chemical gates on the presynaptic side,
Right.
they're reuptake gates.
Yeah, right.
So if they work, they pull chemicals out, right?
Right.
If you inhibit them, they don't pull chemicals out. Is that correct?
No, the thing is, oh, I see what you're saying. No, the thing is they will do one of two, and that's another flavor in it, is they will do one of two things. They will act like the opiates on the postsynaptic side and plug up the gate so that they don't work.
Right.
Or they'll open the gate where they do work all the time.
Okay.
Okay, so you get into things like, in that case, you get into things like MAOI.
inhibitors, yeah.
So they can bias the gates towards opening, or they can bias them towards closing.
Yeah, so you've got a dual effect,
Yeah, the mechanical difference is what I didn't have.
But you are correct. The increase in serotonin, because
Right.
the uptake is not going back, increases the serotonin in there, which does increase the good
Yeah.
feeling of the serotonin, right?
Well, I didn't quite hear all of that, but let's put it this way. Even in the literature, they're still not making any claims about any of this stuff at this stage of the game. If you look at the advertisements, and I've seen a few of them on TV, where they say, take this stuff, whatever this stuff is, and it'll make you feel better. And it's because it is, they say it in these terms, it is thought that because, and they're describing something like this in their diagram on TV. It is thought, because that's really, every little process, hasn't been proven yet. It's just that you have kind of a quantum mechanical situation going on. Medicine is not so much a science as it is an art. It's you give some pill to somebody for something or other, and then oh geez, it grows hair. So now you sell that as a hair grower. But that's not a science. You didn't know that beforehand. It's just that you used it in a different context.
Yeah. Let me take 30 more seconds on this bone. Acetylcholine molecule comes down, it can make the dendrite fire, or it can wander away, or it can be reuptaken above. And if you put in morphine to close the locks, it gets time to wander away.
Yeah, because you put in morphine. Morphine tends to fit all keyholes. It's a real broad spectrum thing. Whereas again, serotonin or let's say Prozac, is a very limited, which is why they call it selected SSRI. It doesn't affect very many keyholes, doesn't do much. You know, it's
Yeah.
just, and then all of these, and God, there's hundreds of them, of different antidepressant drugs, you know. And that's all because of that discovery by Candace Pert, you know, the opiate receptor sites. Okay, we're getting about ready for a lunch break here,
Yeah.
but where we're gonna be going now, that we've got the basic mechanism for this down, and again, don't chisel this stuff in stone, because it isn't, you know, it isn't really all that well, you know, completely understood yet. You know, and certainly not by me, I'm not a neurobiologist. Okay, so it's, so these are just, you know, this gives you a basic understanding of what's going on at that level. And the one thing that I wanted to impart on you with regard to this is how electrical the nervous system really is. It's an electromagnetic thing. And you really do have an aura. You know, those flower children in the 60s were right. You know, you've got an aura. And you do. And all of that stuff is fairly clear to us nowadays, but it wasn't then. That's how recent all of this stuff is. And that's one of the reasons why you can't chisel it in stone. It changes every damn day. Every time a new journal comes out in Science or Neurobiology or Neuron, another journal, things change. And you have to really be up on it. And I can't stay up on that. You know, I can catch it every once in a while, but it's too much for me to read. Where we're going to go when we come back after lunch is we're going to go into so-called extragenetic influences on brain growth and development, particularly in humans, but in everything. This starts then giving us an idea of the structures that we're dealing with and the assemblies of the neurons that we're dealing with, and where all that comes from, and what it all means in terms that we can easily understand, because we've all seen it before. Okay, so that, and then as far as lunch is concerned, let me just do a few housekeeping items on this kind of stuff first, and kind of move on out of that. I had mentioned, you know, that, and then with Lara's question, this is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, is what Prozac is. What Prozac does is it inhibits the reuptake of, you know, neurochemicals back into the cell, so it causes this to be richer than normal, which causes this neuron, if it's firing at rate 1, this neuron will come in more closely to that rate. But they do have other, you know, other chemicals that keep the, you know, like, you know, that keep the gates open. They just have so many different things nowadays that it's incredible. You know, I don't know how one doctor can keep track of them all, you know, because it's just every day they come up with new designer drugs for something else, and now they've got them, so, you know, gosh, if you're afraid of being indoors as opposed to afraid of being airplanes, as opposed to afraid of being around people, or whatever the phobia you might have, they've got a different treatment for it, you know, a different drug treatment, and it's getting to that point. Okay, the remaining thing is that with regard to Candace Pert's book, you know, The Molecules of Emotion, you know, that's really a good book to read, just because it gives you kind of some of the history of neuropharmacology and all that sort of stuff. But you are what you eat in many respects, you know, and I kind of took that to heart a long time ago, not in the sense of my body, but in the sense of my brain. You know, and in order to keep that functioning at a highest level that I can, I do take supplements and that kind of thing. Whatever it takes to keep this sharp, because I've noticed that from one day to the next, And from one time to the next, depending on what you did to yourself yesterday, you know, you are more or less sharp. When I was in graduate school up at UAF, I was one of those people that stayed till 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and then, you know, no fair having a life or anything, and that sort of stuff. But some of the boys, there's only about 3 of the boys left at that time, would go down to the bar. But if I had, you know, and have a couple of beers or something before we went home, well, I didn't, because even a half a bottle of beer would affect me the next day. I couldn't reach as far as I did the day before. So that got, you know, so in other words, just with a small amount of alcohol getting in here, you know, it can really change the mood. And so can, and so can a lot of other things that you do to yourself, and eat and that kind of stuff. The other thing that's kind of really important to mention at this stage of the game to wrap this up is that this is again a couple of years ago. They had a study beginning on the effects of the placebo effect, and it was one of the first studies that they had that were going after the placebo effect. Now, the problem with the placebo effect is that, you know, these double-blind studies and that sort of stuff, you give one group of people the real thing and another group of people a placebo. But there's always a number of those people that get the placebo that have the same beneficial effects as the people who got the real thing. And so there's got to be an explanation for that. And that is can you control your physiology, your body? Does your mind have anything to say about that? And of course it does. Now, that's been well known in yoga circles for a long time, that you can do all kinds of things with your mind. The lesson of Carlos Castaneda and you know, the Yaqui Indian sorcerer Don Juan was this. It wasn't about drugs. I read a critique by the fellow that wrote the book Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches. And that's also an interesting book. He's an anthropologist. Marlon Harris, I think his name is. Anyway, and what he does is he goes back and explains these real curious things that human beings do in this world, you know, and like why are cows sacred in India, and you know, what the heck is the reason for that, and stuff, that kind of thing. How come how come Jews don't eat pork, you know, yada yada, on and on. And so he explains these things as a very credible explanation. Now, as I recall, he's a PhD anthropologist type, a research level. Okay, now he gets into his last chapter of the book is on Carlos Castaneda. Okay, and this is, and in that chapter, he really lamblasts Castaneda and the lesson that he was having, whatever the lesson was that he was teaching. And then, of course, everybody who subscribed to Castaneda was in that cult. You know, it's sort of, and it's still known as kind of a cult classic of its day. You know, and so one of the reasons that thing was so interesting to me is because the guy got it all wrong. He completely missed the point of Castaneda and what the Yaqui Indian sorcerer was saying. It wasn't about drugs at all. What it was about is that if you can take a drug and that modifies your perceptual interface at all, or it makes you happier, or whatever it's doing to you, that's inside of you. You can do that yourself without the drugs. So Castaneda is, and among other things, Castaneda was saying if the grass is greener on the other side of the fence and not so green on your side, make it greener on your site, because you can do that. That's happening in a system that you can control. You know, if the sky isn't blue enough nowadays, make it bluer, etc. That was one of the lessons of Castaneda. Now, one of the things that I had an ability to do, and I assume it's because I went to Sonoma State University, but when I got the last checkup I got on my heart was a stress echo is what it was. You know, they put you on a treadmill and you got wires and tubes and everything running all over the place, and they run you into the ground. You know, and then they make you jump on a table, and then they put sonograms, you know, on you, and take 3D pictures of your heart while it's under a lot of stress. And anyway, while I was being monitored in my, you know, after this thing, and after they had taken the pictures, and their machinery, their PC and whatnot was processing all this stuff, you know, I was sitting there, and the nurse was, you know, on a whole bunch of monitors, you know, monitoring all this stuff going on. You know, and one of them was pulse rate. And that's one of the things that I can do, and blood pressure, is I can purposely slow that and purposely lower the blood pressure. And I was doing that, you know, and the nurse was sitting there, what the heck is going on here? And I know this sounds ridiculous, but I can do that. And I think one of the reasons is why I can is because back in the days when brain waves first came out, well, Sonoma State College, which is a college of the University of California, Berkeley at the time, which is now Sonoma State University, that's a psychology place. So the psychologists from the other building across the way would come over to the physics department and say, how do I hook up these things to make, you know, to look at brain waves on an oscilloscope? And what do those brain waves mean, and so on and so forth? And how do I interpret, etc. And anyway, all those people were in biofeedback stuff. And interestingly enough, you know, your mind alone can even affect those autonomous systems. And it's something that you can learn. You know, and I guess that's where I learned it, because I can still do that. You know, and I just do it pretty much at will. You know, oh, my blood pressure too high, okay, let me lower it here, and then lower it. And I've done that before, and they don't know what's going on, because the problem there is, again, you know, remember the conceptual or the perceptual and conceptual windows that you also have control over. Don't be so fast to just dismiss that as a possibility. That can happen, and it does happen. A lot of people can do that. And you know, and if I had any sense, I'd do that to myself on a more regular basis. You know, but the only thing I'm caring about right now is getting more brain power. I'm not so interested in body, but the brain power. All of that takes place in this synaptic cleft. Okay, now remember this synaptic cleft, because now we're going to go into something else. I'll just keep this on the board for now. We're going to go into something else now, and that's another part of the nervous system. You'll remember from figure 2.4, which is the picture of the Purkinje neuron. This one right here. This picture here, and recall that particular kind of neuron has about 80,000 wires that grow out of it and that come into it as input and output. Okay, so it's got a large number of wires coming in and going out. Now you might ask yourself, well, okay, that's good. Where do those wires come from? You know, you can imagine that they're now there in this thin section that you just took of somebody's brain, and you put a stain on it, a Golgi stain on it, and you look at it, and yeah, okay, it's there now, but how did it get there? Well, one of the things that you can surmise rather rapidly and do some fairly simple arithmetic calculations is that those things have to grow. You know, the neurons themselves, the cell body itself, has to be put into place by the biology of the organism that you're dealing with. It has to be put into place, and then once in place, all of those wires have to grow. They aren't there to begin with, obviously. If you only start off with 2 cells, if that's the way a human being starts, you know, those things have to come from somewhere. And the way they do that, again, is they put the neuron into place, and then the wires start growing. Now, let's look at that particular question right there, the wires. If you have, as you read all kinds of books on neuropsychology, a lot of popular science books on the brain, there's a lot of them nowadays, what you'll run into is a number of different figures for how many neurons a human being has. But the general figure that is used most often is 100 billion, which of course is 10 to the 11. Okay, 10 to the 11 neurons in the human brain and balance of nervous system. Of course, if you talk about the brain, that's so many neurons there that the rest of the nervous system, there's really not that much to the rest of the nervous system except for a lot of wires. Okay, now how dense are the wires? Well, you can see how dense they are from here, but remember this is a drawing, you know, ink on paper drawing from a century ago. That's not all the neuron, I mean, that's not all the wires. As it turns out, the wiring density of a human being is so great that there is scarcely any part of your body that you cannot prick yourself with a needle, for instance, and not feel it. There are very few spots that you can do that. Now, the acupuncturists, for example, they've come up with some of the spots that they can do it. They're good at doing that, finding the spots where it doesn't hurt. But most places and most people can't find those spots. Okay, so that just goes to show you how dense the human nervous system is. And in fact, if you took a human being, put him in this vat, you know, that ate up everything, this acid vat that ate everything but nerves, and then pull that person out, they would still be recognizable as that person. Okay, their hair wouldn't be there, they'd have a real bad complexion, etc. But they still look like that person. They still look like a human being. That's how dense the nerve endings are. But that comes out of the fact that this thing has to be rotated 360 degrees, and that's how dense it is. And that goes for the neurons in most of the body too. Now the back, there are areas in the back that are relatively insensitive to pinpricks, for example. There are areas there. There are other areas that are extremely sensitive, like your hands. You can really feel things with your hands. Okay, now again, the question is, well, where did all those wires come from? Because you didn't start off with them; you had to grow them. Well, if we look at this and we assume, and this is what I've always assumed, and many others as well, is that every neuron has at the very least 10 to the 3 wires associated with axonal processes and dendrites associated with it. Okay, so that, anyway, we're going to have at the minimum 10 to the 14 synapses. Okay, now 10 to the 14 synapses, See, now we're getting into the quadrillions, 100 quadrillion synapses. When in fact, that 10 to the 3 is rather on the low side, because if you look at order of magnitude of a Purkinje cell, at 80,000, that's closer to 10 to the 5. Okay, so instead of 10 to the 14 there, if you look at the brain, which a Purkinje cell is a pretty reasonable neuron to start examining the brain, that would be 10 to the 11 times 10 to the 5, which would be 10 to the 16 neurons. Now it's not quadrillions, and now we're getting 100 quintillion. Okay, we're getting into some really serious numbers here. Okay, and so we've got a lot of wiring going on. And again, where did that wiring come from? Again, it was grown. Now, in the Scientific American came out back, I don't know, the early 70s with a book called The Brain. And it's, really well done, like Scientific American does, with really good pictures and all that sort of stuff. So it's a real interesting book. I should have brought it along with me. But anyway, it's got a lot of articles in it that are toned down from pure type articles. They're toned down a little bit, but not too much. They're still pure articles that give some calculations in there. I took those calculations and the method that they used and started calculating things like how many wires, would a child have to grow from the age of 0, right when they were born, not when they were conceived, but when they were born, to let's say 6 years old. How many wires do they have to grow in order to get to that 6-year stage? Well, one of the things that happens in a human being is that they're born and you still have to grow a fairly substantial number of neural wires before you're complete. And if you say that that's 15% of the neural wiring that you need to complete yourself, then that comes out to be a lot of wires, because 15% of 10 to the 14 is still a huge number. That's still a very large number. And if you only have a certain amount of time to grow those wires in, then you have to grow them fast. Now, the calculations that I gave, and these are in that report to the commissioner, is that your newborn child, the toddler, if you have a toddler and you're bouncing this kid in your arms, and then right behind their eyes, which are extensions of the brain, right behind those eyes, they are growing in order to end up with this many neurons. Now, 15% more neurons by the time they're 6 years old. They have to put into place roughly 4.7 million neurons a minute. Wires a minute, 4.7 million, 24 hours a day for 6 years to get to those kinds of numbers. Okay, they're doing some serious growing on that level. Okay, now there's some interesting things that go on with that wiring, which we'll get into in a minute. The next question is okay, if the neurons have to move into place and then start growing start arterizing, which is reasonable, you have to put the neuron into place first, okay, and then it starts arborizing. Its structure starts connecting to all these other ones. The process of putting those things into place and growing the wires in the fetal stage is even more profound. That's some real serious growing. Okay, so that, and I don't remember those numbers, although if you are interested in them, give me an email and I'll send the numbers to you. I'll excerpt part of the paper I wrote for the state of Alaska on that, the report to the commissioner on the efficacy of the secondary education process in rural Alaska, it's called. Okay.
If your 4 million is correct, the number is about,
I still didn't hear you.
if your 4 million is correct, the number is about 30 million per minute.
In the
In the 9 months.
Yeah, it's much more profound. And keep in mind that when I use these numbers, this is just arithmetic. It's just an average, a gross average. But it gives you an idea of what's happening inside of a child. Okay, now inside of a fetus, that's even more profound. Okay, now what happened when they discovered that was, okay, the question is then, well, wait a minute, if all of those wires are there, all of these wires that we can see right here, if all of those are there, and okay, they have to grow, how do those wires know where to grow? How in the heck do you keep track of that? That's a lot of wires, 10 to the 14, and certainly 10 to the 15, 10 to the 16 is even worse. How do you keep track of where all those wires are supposed to grow? Well, the geneticists, get involved in that, and they finally come to the conclusion that, the DNA molecule cannot possibly contain that much information in order to tell every wire where it's supposed to go. It cannot do it. There's not enough information in all of the permutations and combinations of a DNA molecule to contain that much information, plus all the other information it needs to have everything else go where it goes. Okay, so what they come up with is the notion that, okay, there must be something else going on here other than it's genetically specified right down to the last wire. There must be some other influence here. Okay, and then what that became known as, and this particular article appeared in a journal Science article in the 70s somewhere, be more like the 80s, and it's called Extragenetic Influences on Brain Growth and Development. Now, as it turns out, at about the time I started this stuff myself, there was one of those professors who was doing this kind of research that gave a talk here at APU in the auditorium next door on extragenetic influence of brain growth and development. Okay, now remember the premise is that the DNA molecule can't possibly contain enough information to tell where everything has to be, including the wiring, because the wiring gets to be truly phenomenal numbers, and it just isn't in there. And now, so the conclusion is extragenetic influences somewhere. Okay, that started to be thought about, and the only thing that people can come up with is there has to be some sort of environmental way that occurs. That this set of wires is here, this particular set, as opposed to some other set. Okay, there has to be something that has to do with the environment. Okay, and so then there's this big push on back in the 70s and 80s, to start looking at what those extragenetic influences might be. And one of the things that they came up with is, the experiments. One of the classic experiments was with cats, and this was done in Britain, and by the name of Richard Hawkins, I think, or something like that, whatever. Anyway, he did these original experiments with cats, But let me back up for a minute before we get to the cats. In England, at the same time as all of this is going on, there was a case that they had that ended up being kind of world famous. It was at a time when medical science got to the point where they could do things like repair cataracts on a person's eyes. Okay, and therefore, you could get this person who is well suited for this operation, remove the cataracts, and voila, that person could see. Okay, now, and that's an important word in the context of foundation theory. That person could see. Now we're getting into philosophical problems again. What the heck does that mean? But back in those days, that meant literally that person could see. Very simple. It's not so simple now. Okay, they took this person and they removed the person's cataracts. And what happened to that individual was finally, after not too many months, within a year, he committed suicide, killed himself, because he couldn't live in the world that he was in then. Now, one of the things that became obvious as time went on is that, all right, his eyeballs are just fine. His retina has got the right pictures and stuff on it. Everything, like a CCD camera, the shutters are opening and closing, the lens is perfect, the CCD, chip is good, everything else good. There's something going on back here, though, in the processing part of the brain that just wasn't working because the person really could not see. Okay, so now the philosophers do have to get into it, because now it's a question of, what do you mean see? That kind of thing. And really nailing that down. What do you mean see? Now, he could see, but he couldn't see. Okay, now, and then just to put some more oil on the fire, so to speak, we can take that one step further, and we can go to Don Juan's, and Carlos Castaneda, and seeing in that way. That's another level of seeing. Okay, that's when your conceptual windows are really starting to open. This fellow, and I can't remember, in neuropsychology, they always refer to their case studies with the initials of the individual. And I believe this person's initials were MC. The case study of MC indicated anyway that he could see in a sense, but not in the same sense that we do. And again, he killed himself within about a year. He just could not live in the sensory world that he now found himself in. Whereas before, he was quite well adjusted, quite happy. But why did it get in the papers? Why was it such a big deal? Well, it's because back in those days, this is like the 60s now. This is fairly recent stuff. Back in those days, there was no difference. We were gods. Taking this person who's never been able to see in their life because of cataracts on their eyes, removing them. We were gods. We were restoring their sight. This is what Jesus Christ did. That was a big deal, to do this, except it didn't work. Now they don't do those kinds of operations anymore. And the trick is this. The MC was blind since birth because of those cataracts. Okay, now there, it took a person's life, but there was the essential clue for the neuropsychologists. Okay, the neuropsychologists said, aha, those extragenetic influences have something to do with early development, have something to do with maturation process. There's something there. Okay, so that's where the cat experiments come in. Richard Dawkins, I think, that's his name. Yeah. Anyway, he started the cat experiments, and what he did is take a litter of cats. Okay, and again, here we go again with the various groups of cats, or various groups of humans. But he took one group, he raised them with their eyelids taped shut. Okay, that's all it was, just taped shut. Okay, now he raised another group in an environment with nothing but horizontal lines. He raised another group in an area with nothing but, in an environment, nothing but vertical lines. And that's the only geometric, feature there was in these environments. And then, of course, there's this other litter of cats that are just cats, running around. Okay, the cats that are just running around after the experiment was over, which in the case of the cat, the experiment was over in a relatively short period of time because cats mature at a fairly rapid rate. So you don't have to drag this experiment on for, 21 years or something, like you would of humans.
Is this what they've called the brain plasticity study?
That's that's part of what brain plasticity. The other part of brain plasticity, I'm glad I left this on, is right there in the synaptic cleft. Okay, the reason there's an aspect of brain plasticity there is when you're an addict, and that's the best example. You know that, for example, alcoholics. Well, that's not a good example because that's one example, but drug addicts, okay, they're taking drugs, let's say cocaine. That's the big one nowadays. Okay, they keep taking cocaine, and every day that goes by, they keep having to have more. Okay, that's because at the same time they're taking more cocaine and inhibiting those reuptake receptors, that's what cocaine does, and causing more firing than normal, thus causing them pleasure. The body is trying to restore itself, so it's putting more of those reuptake gates into place. Okay, so now you have to have more cocaine to get the same effect that you had yesterday or the day before. Now that your body's put into place these more things. Okay, now now you're gonna rid yourself of this cocaine addiction. Okay, now you have this incredible crash, and now you can't possibly feel good because you've got all these extra receptors, and it takes a long time to get rid of those. So your addiction just keeps hanging on and on and on until finally, someday, if ever, your body comes back to normal. So that's part of the plasticity, of the human brain. But the other part of it is related to this extra genetic influences. Okay, now, again, getting back to the cats, they're growing in these several different environments now. Okay, when they're finally mature, and again, that not a very long time with cats or mice and that kind of thing, but long enough with cats where you can make some real good observations as you go along. Finally, you get to the point where they're mature now, and you take off the tape, from the cats who had their eyes taped shut, and you find out, now obviously there's nothing wrong with their eyes. No cataracts, there's no nothing, everything's good with their eyes, but they're blind. Okay, they're blind. Doesn't make any difference how good their eyeballs were, they're blind. They walk into things, etc. They can't see anything. Okay, and again, we gotta start worrying about what seeing means. What does that mean? Okay, now, the cats that were raised in these other environments, like with the vertical and horizontal environments, the cats that were raised in the horizontal environments, now keep in mind, this would be a room with rounded off corners and nothing but horizontal stripes painted in the room. And that's all. Since that was all they knew, that was all their environment, that's all the information that was given to them, what happened to those cats? They get out of that environment and into a normal environment, and what do those cats do? If something is vertical, they'll walk right into it. Like, walk right into it, a vertical chair leg or whatever it is. And likewise with the vertical cats, they'd walk right into horizontal things because they couldn't see them. Okay, now, those are the classic cat experiments. Now, those experiments have been duplicated time and time again on several species. There's nothing wrong with the conclusions of those experiments. Now, when you sacrifice the cats, and in Britain they like to say when you kill the cats, we like to say sacrifice over here.
Euthanize.
But when you kill them and take their brain apart, and look at what's missing, you find out that in comparison to the control group, which you also kill, and dissect their brains and thin sections and whatnot, and you look at corresponding thin sections of the visual cortex, you find that these individual cats raised in these individual environments, have vastly different thin sections, which are these things. Okay, that you see noticeable differences. There's whole structures missing. Okay, so what's the conclusion? Well, extragenetic influence has come into play by virtue of environmental influences. Okay, now what does that mean? What's the model for how that works? Okay, finally what the model is, now remember you're taking these hordes of cats and whatever else you're using as guinea pigs. You're raising them in these weird environments, and you can, for example, if you have 20, 30, 100 cats, whatever it is, and you're raising them in an environment of nothing but vertical lines, you can take 5, 10 of them, take 5 of them, let's say, and kill them and then take a look at thin sections of their visual cortex all along the maturation process. Okay, you can do that, and that's what they do. That's exactly what they do. That goes on again with lots of other species. David Grove's, his experiments were on chicks. Well, these little chickens running around. There have been thousands of those chickens, sacrificed to brain research to come at the answers to these questions. That's okay. We eat chicken all the time, so what the heck? We sacrifice them to eat them, so we can sacrifice them to see how our brains work. Anyway, they finally come to the conclusion by staging it, 5 days into the experiment, 10 days into, and just, through time, looking at the structures, what they finally conclude is that the way nature has taken care of this problem of where all these wires go is that what it does is that for each group of neurons, and remember you have a lot of different kinds of neurons, and let's just say you have 100 different kinds. Okay, well, each one of those groups of neurons in a human being will arborize at a different stage of its maturation process. Okay, the visual cortex will arborize at during one period of time, whereas the auditory cortex will arborize in a different period of time. Or it may overlap or whatever. but it has its own arborization stage. Okay, now during this arborization stage, what happens is that the brain, and not just our brain, this is the cats too, the mice, the chickens, whatever, you know, what happens is that nature during that particular phase in the neuron's maturation just have the neurons grow wires everywhere. Connect to anything, it doesn't matter, connect everywhere. Connect anywhere within the capacity of that neuron to grow wires, you know, and extended wires on into areas where they wouldn't ordinarily grow anything, just grow zillions of them. Okay, and then nature then inserts another little rule of the game, is if you don't use it, you lose it. You know, so the rule of the game is use it or lose it. And that's what's happening with the cats. The vertical cats aren't using their horizontal amplifiers, if you want to put it in those terms. So the horizontal amplifiers just die out. They're not there. And it's for sure they're not there, because you can look at the synthetic section of the brain, again like this is, only now we're looking at entire structures, and those structures aren't there. You know, in those vertical cats or the horizontal cats. And then in the blind cats, there's hardly any structures at all. You know, so they are truly blind. And then let's introduce that notion right now. The operational amplifiers are not there. You know, those particular devices that allow you to see verticalness and horizontalness, etc., simply aren't there. Okay, now this was tested time and again on, again, all kinds of different species. But then the psychologists got a hold of it and started looking at human beings. Okay, and what we find out in human beings, now we can't, here's all these kids in Barrow. You know, okay, they're raised on this environment that's flatter than just on a plate up there. You know, it's just flat. You know, and so and so this is what their environment is. And in the old days, it was even more so that was the case. Do those kids end up being arborized differently than the same kid, the control kid now, raised in New York? And the answer is yes. And the proof of that is reasonably easy to arrive at, you know, by the various tests that they have nowadays. So are there, for example, cultural differences? Well, to the extent that culture goes with place in an environment, then yeah, there are cultural differences. Are, SATs and all that sort of stuff biased? Yes. Now, as to why nobody can quite handle that, I don't know. That's their problem. All I can do, and the other people who do this kind of stuff can do, is say, well, here's the reality of it. You have to make up your own mind what the deal is. Now, one of the things that this, and then we'll take a break here, but one of the things that this corresponds to is this. To give you a good educational example, is they do things like this. They have a thing in the Indian education pot of money, called the Johnson-O'Malley Act. Okay, that Johnson-O'Malley Act, then you take that money, take it to your school here in rural Alaska, or to an Indian reservation in the lower 48, and you teach cultural type things. Okay, so for example, let's say you take the Johnson-O'Malley Act and you want to teach language in your school. Okay, and then let's say, and then we'll continue this more after the break, but let's say you take this language and it doesn't have a written part to it, but that's okay because you know how to make an alphabet and you know how to write already. So let's make an alphabet and write this language down. Okay, we write it down and now we teach it to the children. The children. You know, the parents already know how to speak Inupiaq, for instance, from the old days. In the same way that I understand, you know, the few words that I understand. I understand the feelings now in this, in what they're saying, but I don't understand Inupiaq anymore, even though I spoke it at one time. And now, their parents learned it in the traditional way. Now their children are learning it in this other way. The question now that I have for you, given the results of all of these experiments, and there were many, many of them, the question I have for you, do these children, now that they speak Inupiaq, and these parents, given that they already do speak Inupiaq, are they speaking the same language? And I'll leave you with that as a question.
Okay.
Let's move on with this deal. Anyway, is that we have the extra genetic influences that are putting into place all these wires. Okay, now that is under the rule of, you know, your neurons at some stage grow wires everywhere, and then at some stage in that process, they are either utilized or they simply atrophy. In the same way that if you're in a wheelchair for any length of time, and you don't get physical therapy, you know, to take care of the problem, and, you know, when you're ready to get out of that wheelchair, you're not walking anytime soon because your muscles are just atrophied. You know, they just go to hell on in a handbasket. That applies to everything in your body, and that's just a biological principle. Okay, so what we can do is we can editorialize and surmise a lot of things, and, you know, and we can come to a lot of conclusions because of this thing. Okay, now, what does that do in any event, you know, for us, as far as foundation theory? And hopefully we'll, you know, start focusing in on where all of that's going with regard to foundation theory. But remember, some of the lessons in this extra genetic influences was, you know, that these things are environmentally controlled, and these structures allow for the ability to do things that we call see, for example, or that we call hear, for another example. Okay, now those two things are what I'm working on primarily at this stage of the game. Okay, and then what we have then is we have structures, which are neurons, you know, all tangled together, that make these things, these structures that we can see easily enough if we take a thin section and we see in the cats they are there or they are not there. And we remember we have a control group who are raised in a normal surroundings, and they have a particular structure associated with their visual cortexes, or their visual cortices, if you want to put it that way. They have a particular structure, and the other ones raised in these bizarre environments don't have the same structure. So what does that tell you? Well, is there some wiring diagram in those structures that allows for normal seeing? Okay, normal seeing or normal hearing. Okay, there's some kind of structure and it's wired somehow to allow for that. Okay, now, the next thing is that, okay, what is it that these structures are allowing you to see? Well, you know, that was another question that came along, what are those structures allowing you to see it? Are they allowing you to see horizontalness and verticalness and diagonals and, you know, stuff like that? Is that what they're allowing you to see? And it's more complicated than that. It's more profound than that. In other words, if you took a strictly mathematical point of view, you could take a cat, the same cats. Okay, now we take another group of those cats and we raise them in an environment with, you know, two-dimensional coordinate systems in them. Okay, but, you know, just horizontal, just vertical, that's all. No diagonals. But then they should be able to put together those diagonals, one would think. You know, oh, they can see vertical, they can see horizontal, so therefore they can see diagonal. And that's not quite right either. It's more complicated than that. It's not a mathematical, it's not, in other words, what the brain is doing is not directly rational. What the nervous system and the networks of the nerves are doing is not directly rational.
They're not linear.
Not in the sense that we think of it consciously.
Not linear.
Okay, so there's something more profound going on. Okay, and so now that we've got these structures that we know from the cats, let's keep that in mind for a little while here, because now we've got a lot of other things with regard to brain growth and development. Is that we have these 100 neurons or so that are different kinds of neurons, and we also know at this stage of the game that these things are not just spread willy-nilly throughout the body and brain. They tend to be in isolated geographic areas, and they tend to make certain structural areas of the brain. For example, Parkinson's disease is affected by a structure called substantia nigra, which produces dopamine, naturally produces dopamine. When that substantia nigra dies, and it often does, for other environmental reasons, like currently it's related to insecticide in the environment. In other words, in places where there's a lot of insecticide, agricultural areas, in cities too, where there's a lot of really bizarre pollutants in the air and so on and so forth, you'll find a higher incidence of this problem than you will in Alaska, for example. Okay, so that they're zeroing in on, you know, the problems associated with what causes the substantia nigra to die. And it, you know, and again, it looks like it's something to do with the environment, whatever. But then it starts producing less dopamine, and then the individual who has this problem starts getting these problems of motor control and so on and so forth, and then they end up in the terminal stages where they're just frozen into position. They have no motor control at all. They're just frozen into position. Okay, now this, you know, these things are starting to give us clues to how it is that we're going to, you know, how it is that we need to build these structures and what we need to find out about these structures. Now, the way they try to treat Parkinson's disease, and by the way, you have a picture in here of Parkinson's disease, and that's that colored photograph right here. And you'll notice just by looking at those, if you look at the normal, the one with Parkinson's disease, and the one there on the bottom, the Parkinson's disease with the tissue implant, you'll notice that for a given cognitive task, there are different things going on. Different areas of the brain light up. Okay, now the areas that are in red, or near red, orange, those areas are the areas in highest use. Now, this is a PET scan, which is positron emission tomography, but what it's measuring is it's measuring nutrient uptake in these groups of neurons that use dopamine. Okay, and that's what you're seeing by those red areas. And obviously, the three different sets of pictures are different from each other. Obviously, the Parkinson's person, has really got no dopamine areas going on for them at all. Whereas with the Parkinson's with a tissue implant, now by tissue implant, that means dopamine producing tissue that will replace the now compromised substantia nigra. Okay, now the big deal nowadays on stem cell research, well, stem cells can be made to be dopamine producing cells. Okay, and if they do that, they can implant them in the brain, and you'll notice the big improvement when you do that. The Parkinson's with tissue implant is in much better shape than the person with Parkinson's. So this person becomes more mobile, more able to exist in their environment. Or you can give them dopamine pills and, L-Dopa, and that causes a tremendous difference. The unfortunate aspect about giving them L-Dopa is the same thing that happens up here with addicts. L-Dopa is an artificial thing. It's a dopamine substitute. It's like dopamine, but it's not dopamine. Okay, so it gets in there, it messes around with the receptor sites, and as a result, the body tries to fix itself and puts into place other sites to accommodate that. So you've changed that person physically by giving them that L-Dopa, and then pretty soon that person has acclimatized, that's not the word, but they've gotten used to it, just in the same way that an addict needs more and more dope to produce the same high, to produce the same level of motor control. That person needs more and more L-Dopa. Pretty soon they die of the L-Dopa, and so you can't keep that going forever. Okay, so as a result, they go to the tissue implants, and that's the hope of the stem cell research, regardless of what your religious convictions are or anything like that. That's what the idea is put those dopamine producing tissue in there and then try to help this person. Now, with regard to that kind of an observation, that kind of observation has been made. In other words, here's this person with a real bad case of Parkinson's disease, and when I was a professor here at this college, the provost at the time, his father had Parkinson's, and he was about out of the ability to take any more L-Dopa, and so the provost he was at the time, that was what they called the second guy in command, and he came to me and asked about this kind of a problem, and I told him what I knew, and I talked to the individual who had the Parkinson's, and gave him a number of things that he could possibly do, which were, just not holistic medicine, but it was, natural stuff that he can do, which it turns out helped him quite a bit. But of course, there's no defeating Parkinson's if you don't do something like a tissue implant. You've got to do something like that to get around this problem. Now, they keep making better and better L-Dopa, but it keeps, you still have those side effects eventually. So the way to go is that implants with dopamine producing tissue, which you can make from stem cells.
How long do those implants last?
Okay, now, what does that tell us though? Well, one of the things that happens with these people when you have a person with Parkinson's, so now you get a bunch of dopamine producing cells and you stick those into their brain. Okay, now they've got the real thing to work with. They obviously get a lot better. They're obviously way more normal than they were before. But one of the other things that happens during that same time is that it is noticed. Oh, that's how long do the cell implants last? That's that's part of the problem is where how long do they last and where do you put them? And in some cases they last a while, but they don't last forever. Again, the body will start trying to put itself right. And so you're dealing with a very complex system here. Now, we're not going to be dealing with that kind of a complex system on the one hand, but on the other hand, if I were talking to a bunch of neurosurgeons now, who had these kind of problems, they would think maybe some of the things that I'm going to get into later, like tensors, oh my God, how can you keep track of that? Well, I don't know how these people keep track of what they're doing. Questions like this. That's a real bad one. Now, but interestingly though, the question I was going to bring up now is this. You'll remember that I had said at the beginning that, nobody knows anything about how the brain works, how it actually works. Nobody knows anything about what memory is, what it actually is. In a very, very, very basic sense, like an aphasia memory, we know what it is. We know the mechanisms of memory. We know a few mechanisms of memory. One of the mechanisms of memory is wiring. Another mechanism of memory is synaptic strength. In other words, the synapses can grow more or less strong, more or less able to transmit information from one cell to the other. That's another mechanism of memory. Again, the other mechanism is remembering by wiring. And that's a real particular difference between men and women. Men and women are wired differently in the sense that in women, the right and left hemisphere through the corpus callosum in a woman is a much thicker, denser wiring, going from one hemisphere to the other. There's more of an integration between the two hemispheres. Men are more isolated in the left hemisphere. Or if you're left-handed, in the right hemisphere. Okay, now in these Parkinson's patients and in other patients, along those lines, and when I say along those lines, let's take another example of a heart transplant. Okay, now there's another big nervous system, the heart. There's a lot of nerves going on there. We all know that because presumably we've all once before at least been in love. Didn't you feel that in your heart? Not just your head. Didn't you feel that here? Sure, I did. You feel it in your heart. And that's, of course, why the Greeks thought that was so important, is there is a nerve, there's a very dense nervous system in there. So that what would you expect of somebody who had a heart transplant, or not a heart transplant, let's make it better than that, let's call it an artificial heart. Now we've had some of those people too. Okay, that's taking a real big chunk of nervous system out of that individual, and in the case of an artificial heart, not replacing it with anything. That's like taking the substantia nigra out, or some other piece of your brain out, or nervous system. Okay, what happens to that person? Well, interestingly, the Parkinson's patients and the heart transplant and heart replacement people, there has been the experience by their immediate family members that this is a different person. I'm not talking to the same person anymore. If I had Parkinson's one day and an implant the next day, and there was, let's say, a week or two in between, or time, a little bit of time, then somebody who knew me would notice that there was something different about me. I'm now behaving differently. Remember those two lines that I drew? You know, the perceptual interface and the behavioral interface. Okay, now what we're doing is we're trying to determine what's in here. You know, what's in that black box? What's happening in there? Okay, somebody comes in, okay, I have Parkinson's. In my case, I have some shakiness associated with me. It's not what you would call Parkinson's, it's called getting older. Things don't work as well as they used to. You know, that's about what it amounts to. But if I had Parkinson's, as indicated there, and then as indicated after the tissue implant, I would be a lot better. And then people who knew me, who would come in and visit with me, say, once a week, once a month, whatever, they would notice a difference between the two times. Okay, and so what's happening there is it's a very real demonstration of what memory is and how the brain works. There's some really important clues there. And particularly with regard to the heart, you know, where you're taking an entire structure, you know, a heavily wired structure out of the picture, that person ends up being a different person. And that's noticeable to particularly the relatives of these people, that they're dealing with somebody else now. You know, which is kind of scary in a sense. You know, it's to think that you go in and you can keep your life going by getting a heart transplant, like, for example, having a heart grown in a pig, and then getting that transplanted to you, which they're doing nowadays, and keeping you alive that way. But then you're a different person. And we're going to be looking at why you're a different person. But again, we're looking inside between the perceptual and behavioral interface. The way you can tell that I'm different is you come in and visit me. You say something that you've said before, and in response, I say something different now that I've had this tissue transplant. And so on down the line. Then pretty soon you realize, gosh, there's something really different about this person. And I've seen that, you know, a number of times in just my dealings in this world. Okay, so what we want to do is get at that structure. Other ways that we know about structure, and you'll remember that I used the words operational amplifier as in electronics. You know, though they do have operational amplifiers in electronics that do something, that do some function. You put something in and something comes out of a particular nature, only let's just say amplified. Okay, so you'll have in a radio intermediate frequency amplifiers, or you know, or radio frequency amplifiers. You can isolate those with dotted lines and call them operational amplifiers. Okay, and that's something like what's going on in a biological brain, particularly a human brain. And we know that because of, speaking of using people for cannon fodder, wars have given us a real good, a real good way to get at brain injuries. People get shot in the head and every other damn thing, in every place you can think of. So as they keep the records on all of that, they pretty much have a good idea about what most areas of the brain do. If you get a piece of shrapnel or a bullet or something in a particular area, thus destroying it, that does something to you. That causes some operational difficulty for you. And then nowadays in our instant communication and all that stuff, it's even worse. We have all kinds of information, even worse or even better, depending on your point of view. There was a book written not too long ago. My wife thought my hat, or I thought my wife thought my hat was my head, or something like that. And, where a person starts doing things like taking an object and associating that with something else entirely, that comes up in neuropsychology. And there are some just bizarre examples of that. I gave my niece a book which is called The Story of Ruth. This was a woman who was imagining a whole universe out there, her own universe. People, and they would, walk, and these weren't real people, these existed in her head. They'd walk behind somebody, disappear, and walk out that way. The shadows were there. All of these things that a very clever psychiatrist, got to by carefully studying and carefully listening. But these things actually occur, and there are some real bizarre ones. That one's not so bizarre. Okay, now we're coming up to another break here, but the question now is, okay, we've got that. We've got the story of Ruth, where there's a universe imagined. Now, by universe imagined, I don't mean an entire universe. It's this world. It's just that there's people out there in this world that she lives in that aren't there. There's events happening to her that aren't happening in anybody else's world, but they're happening to her. Okay, we have the cats that are raised in vertical environments and so walk into these horizontal legs, and these chairs that jut out. What are those cats thinking? They can't see those things. What the hell is this? That kind of thing. What are the cats thinking? What about the people who have perceptual windows that are real narrow and conceptual windows that are even narrower? What about those people? Okay, now what kind of universe do they live in? And that's, and the question then is what about your perceptual windows? Your own. What is it that you're not seeing? You can bet your life there's a lot out there you're not seeing. And you can bet your life on that, because that's true. Now, what is that? And then, as Carlos Castaneda or Don Juan, the Yaqui Indian sorcerer would say, essentially, this is what he would say: don't sing the way we were. The grass was greener, the skies were bluer. If the grass isn't green enough, make it greener. If the sky is not blue enough, make it bluer. That's the lesson. You can do that. If you can get rid of headaches just because you want to, and I can slow my heart up and speed it up and slow it down, and do my blood pressure just because I want to, just because of the heck of it, then I can do those things too. Now, what I do, though, is I take Prozac to help me. Well, evacuate path will filter frequencies down to one cycle one cycle. I mean, that it can filter it down to incredible degrees. And so the worry about bandwidth, to the telecom people is really largely settled for at least the next several years, just by virtue of Variance Corporation technology. Now, it's important to realize, from my point of view, where we started, with those circles and the perceptual, the objective universe and all that stuff, and the idea that that objective universe is a mathematical universe, in fact, and that, in fact, those mathematical equations are the same as the operations of a brain, for example, so that if you can get at those operations, what you end up with is something that can be reified in some other menu, like electronics. And then that's for sure, you can do that. You don't have to worry about it or anything, that can be done. Okay, now most of the people out there, in that world out there, and in the thing that I'm talking mostly about now are the telecom people. Again, Gerard had a lot of contact with that world because he represented that world, in his dealings as a patent litigator. Okay, in his dealings as a patent litigator, he got to go talk to them and have lunch with them and everything else. But when you start talking to them about this, okay, they need a prototype and all that stuff. But what do you need to do to convince these people that this is real? So in other words, this is a perceptual window problem they have, and a conceptual window problem they have also. And they really have blinkers on, blinders on. They're not seeing the whole picture here. If they went to a lot of school, like a lot of them have PhDs, and they can see, and some of those people can see what the ENL and the AFA are doing. For example, our lawyers, Finnegan, those two guys that represent Variance, at the patent prosecution level, understand